I am so excited today to host Reverend Katie O'Dunn. I am going to read just a small part of her incredible bio because I just want to hear what she has to say. So, Reverend Dr. Katie O'Dunn is a chaplain who works in the intersection of faith and OCD. She supports clinicians seeking to understand theological nuances in the development of culturally responsive treatment, helps clergy offer spiritual support without reassurance, and encourages individuals navigating OCD to reimagine treatment as an opportunity to connect with their faith. Katie is the founder and director of the Stick with the Ick, a virtual faith and OCD community app, and the logo on my favorite new fidget from the OCD conference, a consultant on religion for OCD Institute of Texas, and lead advocate for the International OCD Foundation. Prior to working with Faith and OCD, Katie was ordained in the United Church of Christ, and also she has a doctorate of ministry, correct? Did I
Yes.
get that
Yeah.
all right? Okay. I mean, wow, wow, wow. I am so excited for this conversation. I met you very recently, and you opened my mind to this whole other side of OCD advocacy, but from a faith-based perspective. And so I am so excited to get started.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation. And when you reached out, this is my favorite thing to talk about under the sun. So I'm excited to dive
Oh,
in. Thank you.
oh wow, wonderful. All right, so let's just overall, let's define faith-based OCD for our listeners.
Yeah. So I always love to start, whether folks really know OCD or not, by reminding everybody that OCD latches on to, we know, the things that are the most important to us, everything significant. And of course, it makes sense that when faith is something so significant to so many people, that equally OCD will latch on to their religion or to their spirituality or to their morality. And that's really where scrupulosity comes into play. Scrupulosity OCD is a facet of OCD that relates to religious beliefs or morals, and where it really latches onto that for someone and kind of twists it and makes them question if they really know what they believe, if they believe the correct thing, if they're good enough, if they're moral enough. And the word, it's really fascinating. Scrupulosity comes from the Latin scrupulum, which actually means small, sharp stone. And I think this is so spot on for OCD in all of
Perfect.
its forms of this stone in our shoe that the more we try to pull it
Mm.
out, the more we try to ignore it, the more we try all of the things, the more we try to get rid of it, it becomes more and more apparent. And that's very much the case with scrupulosity. The more someone tries to reassure themselves about their beliefs or make sure that they believe the right thing or that they really didn't sin, OCD becomes bigger and bigger. Because when we're talking about scrupulosity or really faith-based or religious-based OCD, I love also starting by saying it is not a religious issue. It's an
Yes.
OCD issue. It's OCD
Mhm.
just latching on to something that's the most important to someone.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for clarifying that scrupulosity does not have to be for people who are religious. Scrupulosity is actually a more universal sense of the difference between right and wrong, and being a good person on this earth. So thank you so much, Reverend. So on a personal level, it is human nature to have doubt. What helps you differentiate between healthy doubt and OCD doubt?
Yeah. So I think doubt, questions, uncertainty, all of those things are actually really beautiful, especially within the context of faith. And I always tell folks that even from a faith perspective, some people say that they're public theologians. I always say that I am a publicly uncertain theologian. I am very public about how uncertain I am in so many facets of life. And
Mhm.
I think having doubts, having questions, being uncertain actually isn't the opposite of faith. It's a part of faith. It's
Mhm.
not knowing the answers and continuing to steps towards something that's important to us anyway. But where it becomes kind of in this OCD realm is when it's coming from a space of feeling really urgent, or I have to get this right, or there's no other option, or there is this shame and guilt associated. And that's very different from genuine curiosity that goes alongside healthy doubt as we're exploring faith or really exploring anything in the world. So we do a lot of work with support groups I lead around defining faith as, we use Henry Nouwen often to say it's an adventure in the unknown, but OCD takes that adventure and makes it actually feel like it's a really, really scary adventure. So it almost hijacks what's normal questioning and makes it feel like, well, something horrible is going to happen if you don't know the answer, if you don't get this exactly right. So as soon as we start to see that fear, that urgency, that guilt, that shame, I have to get the answer right now, that's where it starts to cross into the line of OCD. And more often we see people engaging in compulsions that may look like faith practices, but that are actually just to alleviate those really challenging feelings.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So just to kind of reiterate what I'm hearing, it sounds like healthy doubt, especially in a religious or a moral context, feels like curiosity, feels like growth, feels like you're on a life adventure to become your best self. On the other hand, OCD doubt feels like fear, like urgency, like trying not to, do something horrible. Does that summarize it a little bit?
Absolutely. And I think, what I often tell folks is I'll say, wow, you have an awesome question. Where is that question coming from? And they're like, well, I need you to answer this right now theologically, or the entire world will explode. And I'm like, okay, great. We are not going to talk about that right now. But if we delay that, and 5 weeks from now, you're actually asking because you're like, you know what? I really wonder. And this is something really interesting that I'd like to explore. Then maybe we can explore that. So I think there isn't, it's not that there are certain categories of doubt around faith that are all of a sudden OCD or not OCD. It's really that significance that we place on them. And I think sometimes there's anxiety for folks who feel like, well, I'm never going to be able to talk about this theological question ever in my whole life. And that's not necessarily the case. Now, you probably will never have a very specific answer, but when it's no longer coming from a place of anxiety and fear and shame and guilt and urgency, there's opportunities to explore really beautiful sides of uncertainty.
I love that. Thank you so much. You mentioned religious compulsions. If you could just quickly address what's the difference between a ritual that's part of a religion and a compulsion that is in reaction to an faith-based OCD?
Yeah, absolutely. So anything really can become compulsive. So it's not like, oh, prayer is or isn't compulsive. It's different for each person. And it's really based on the function, just like any other facet of OCD. So if someone is engaging in a religious ritual in a way that is in response to an obsession, because they're trying to get rid of these feelings of fear, guilt, shame, anxiety, or they're trying to gain certainty. Maybe they're doing that thing over and over again. It typically is crossing over into a compulsion. One of the helpful ways in looking at that can be the function, but also can be looking at what others do within the faith community. And once something is crossing over from normative practice within that faith community, that can be a really good sign that there might be something compulsive going on. And this is where I know we'll get into faith leaders being a part sometimes of that conversation, because this could look very different in different denominations of Christianity or different sects of Judaism or Islam. We're really looking at what's typical in the congregation can be so helpful. But what I often say is, yes, prayer in and of itself or ritual in and of itself isn't compulsive. But as soon as we're doing it just to rid ourselves of intrusive thoughts or anxiety or any of those things, it's actually no longer really a religious practice. It's almost worshiping OCD, which sounds like a strange thing to say. But I really see it as we're no longer connecting with God. We are literally unintentionally worshiping and making OCD larger.
Oh, wow. That's an incredible concept. I have noticed that people uh maintain their OCD tenets with a very passionate fervor. And when matched with, the competing worship in religion, I think it can feel very confusing, which is which. Um, Something really interesting that you said that I want to reiterate for our listeners is that when you're trying to decide if something is a compulsion or not, make sure not to be culturally normative.
Mhm.
Uh, Make sure to understand that there are different standards of practice, and the most important metric seems to be function.
Mhm.
So why is this act being performed? Is it out of fear? Is it out of a feeling that without doing this, you won't have safety or certainty?
Mhm.
Um, Beautiful. Okay. So what got you into activism for OCD as a religious leader?
Yeah. So the very long story short is I've navigated OCD since before I can remember in my own life, and was very private about that, especially moving through theology school and seminary and moving through my ordination process. And part of that, unfortunately, was as I was moving through seminary and ordination, my OCD got really bad. And I shared with some leaders in the community that I thought I needed to seek treatment. And I was told not to do that because it would impact me as an up and coming minister. So I actually figured out ways to push that down and to get around that on my psych evaluations. I mean, all of the things. And then ended up in my first, was ordained and still had really bad OCD, and ended up in my first chaplaincy role as the academy chaplain at the largest private school in the country. So I was the chaplain for 2,700 awesome kiddos from different faith backgrounds. And that's really what got me into interfaith work, because I was working with students who were Jewish and Christian and Buddhist and Muslim and Sikh and Jain and atheist and agnostic. But I had really tough OCD at the time that was untreated, and I wanted no one to know. And there was so much pressure in the role. I entered at age 25, just ordained, and my predecessor had been there 25 years. I was the first female in the role, and it felt like I need to get this right. I need to
Mm.
get everything right. And we know that's impossible. We are not going to get everything right. And externally, it looked like I was doing very well in the role with programming, and internally I was putting so much pressure on myself. And as someone who navigated particularly moral scrupulosity and harm OCD, I was at the front line of trauma and loss, and unfortunately lost a number of students to their own mental health struggles, including one of my favorite students, and was responsible for the care of thousands of people in that, while I was blaming myself for those losses as someone with harm OCD and moral scrupulosity and false memory OCD. So I hit rock bottom, blaming myself for things that I wasn't responsible for, and standing up in front of services I was officiating for kids, feeling like things were my fault that were not my fault. And ultimately ended up from that experience seeking treatment in secret at night. And it saved my life. Evidence-based treatments like ERP absolutely saved my life. And wanted to not be quiet about that experience anymore for the kids that I was working with who were afraid to come forward in their religious communities. So started to share my story and thought that no one would respect me anymore. And it was the opposite. I started hearing from families asking, well, how do I talk to our rabbi or to our priest or to our imam? And it ended up leading to an entire shift in career and vocation, and going back to do doctoral work in this area to be able to work in the area of faith and OCD and scrupulosity full time, both to advocate for folks in communities who are navigating OCD, but also to train clinicians in interfaith literacy and to train clergy in how to recognize and how to offer support and how to not stigmatize individuals navigating the journey.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that story. It means so much to me. I think that leaders in the OCD community, having lived experience of OCD, is so supportive to our clients that there isn't a sense of, we're up here and they're down here. We're all in this together. And so thank you so much for that moment of vulnerability. And also, I learned something that it had not occurred to me before this moment, which is awful. I did not realize or think about the fact that religious leaders like you also contend with losing people whom they've been supporting through their mental health journeys to suicide. So I just like to, mention September is National Suicide Awareness Month. And I would also like all of us to be aware of the grief that we carry in the helping professions, especially those of us who have harm OCD and are prone for that sort of self-blame cycle. So thank you so much, Reverend. That was very powerful.
Well, and I'll say with that, I'm so glad that you brought this up, and it's something that I think is so needed as a whole in the OCD community, and chaplains and religious leaders experience this, and of course clinicians experience this, and unfortunately I've had my share of losses in OCD work as well, and I co-led with an amazing psychologist in the community at the OCD conference this year, the first support group for providers who had lost a patient to suicide. And it was an incredible experience. And we're also in conversation about continuing that and trying to develop a supportive network and resources so that people don't feel alone as providers in that space. So if anyone is listening, that is something that you would like to be a part of, we would love to have you either involved in facilitation or even for us to support you and be with you in your own journey.
Oh, beautiful. I feel like this is a gift for me. I just had my first experience of that yesterday, actually, and I can't actually talk about it yet without crying, but wow, like I didn't even know that you had hosted that Chicago OCD conference next July. I think it is. I will be in that chair with Reverend Katie. Thank you so much. And so on this subject of religious leaders speaking to OCD therapists, which I didn't introduce myself, I'm Natalia. I run an OCD center in Colorado. And I am not part of the religious leadership community. And so what I want to know as an OCD clinician is, what am I doing wrong? What do you see the OCD therapists most miss and misunderstand when they try to treat faith-based OCD?
Yeah. No, thank you so much for this question. And thank you for your own vulnerability too. And would love to connect with you further because we are all in this together. But for this question, I think first of all, I want to instill confidence in the amazing clinicians who are listening, because I think often what I see is the biggest barrier is fear around having conversations around religion. And all the time, most of my life now is spent training kind of clinicians in this area in interfaith literacy and religious scrupulosity. And the biggest question I get is, what if I don't know the answer? What if I get it wrong? What if I say something that offends? And what I always tell folks is, you don't have to know all of the things about every single religion. You can, of course, I would love to do a training with you or to put you in touch with resources, but I think there's a really amazing opportunity for you to actually have open conversations with the client and say, oh, I am so excited to learn more about your faith practice. And I read all of these beautiful things on Sunni Islam, but I still don't know fully what you do. And I would love for you to tell me about that. And I think by having open conversation and dialogue, sometimes there is fear, but actually putting that fear aside and telling the person, I don't know all of the things, but I want to, and I want to support you and affirm you in the development of this culturally responsive treatment and thinking through what's important to you. A really amazing relationship can be developed. And then I think along with that, the exposure piece in particular with treatment, I think can be challenging for clinicians. And you spoke a little bit earlier too, sometimes I think folks want to dive into things that are cookie cutter because it's okay, I've read this and this exposure must work for Judaism, right? And it's so different if you are talking to someone in a Reform or an Orthodox community, and even within that, the community that they're a part of. So really getting to know them, their OCD, their core fear, engaging their faith leaders, and then thinking about, how can I make them uncomfortable as a part of this treatment without crossing the line into disrespect. So I always talk about there being kind of this line that can sometimes be difficult to navigate of discomfort versus disrespect, where we never want to cross the line of an individual's religious values, but we do want to do things that are scary in favor of making OCD smaller. So with that, I'll often tell clinicians, there's a couple of things we can do to navigate that. One is the 80-20 rule. It's looking at what 80% of folks in the community might be willing to engage in as an exposure in favor of reconnecting with their faith. And another thing is either engaging the faith leader or asking the client directly, why do you not want to do this exposure? And it sounds like a strange question, but I always say that because no one who walks into treatment is ever going to be like, yes, I want to do this exposure. This sounds awesome. That has never been my experience. But the why with religious scrupulosity exposures becomes really important. Because if the why is, well, I'm scared something bad's going to happen, or that God is going to punish me, or that I'm not doing something in line with my faith, that might be a good exposure. If they say, well, this is something that crosses my faith boundaries and that no one else would do in my faith community, probably not something that we should be crossing into. So figuring out how to balance those two sides.
Beautiful. I have not been in the habit of asking my clients why they don't want to do an exposure. I think that's a brilliant point, that is part of the curiosity you engage with in order to have multicultural competency with religion, especially. Wonderful. So
and I'll name too, for just one other piece for clinicians that might be helpful to look up. I always love introducing clinicians to, even as you're asking someone about their religious practices, the FICA model, which is something that chaplains typically use. But it's a really easy acronym, and it's FICA, so that you can remember. And the F is just asking, what is your faith and what are your faith practices? The I is asking the importance. How is this significant to you and to your life? The C is, what is the community involvement like? How do you connect in that way? How do they support you in your mental health treatment or not? And the A is, how do you feel comfortable with me addressing it? How do you want me to talk about your religion? How do you want me to be involved? And that can be just a really simple acronym to remember some of the things that are actually really important and can be such a relationship building space to talk about.
I love that. The FICA model. We're going to put that down in the description for people to learn more about that. So on that note, how do you, in contrast, how do you speak to faith leaders about OCD?
Yeah. So I love offering faith leaders a role. So I always kind of have two components. It's one, here are things that are not helpful, but also in addition to that, here are things that are helpful, because faith leaders do, I think, have something really beautiful to offer. And I think it's really easy to fall into just saying, please don't reassure, but there is another role that they can play. So I tell faith leaders, of course, we don't want to reassure. We don't want to tell someone that these are spiritual concerns. We don't want to shame them for intrusive thoughts that they're having. So all of those things. But what faith leaders can do is work alongside the clinician to explain what is value-driven practice within that faith community. And they can also offer affirmation as opposed to reassurance to the person navigating treatment. They can offer hope through a theological lens and talk with the person about, well, here are places within your religious text that someone did something really hard in order to reconnect with their faith. So most of my doctoral work has been around reimagining ERP as a spiritual practice, because a spiritual practice really is anything that we're doing that's challenging in order to reconnect with the divine. And treatment really can be that for so many people. We're doing something that breaks down the OCD and that makes the OCD smaller so that we can stop worshiping OCD and actually worship God. And faith leaders can be a part of explaining what that looks like in an individual's theological context while offering support and hope that that person can, in fact, move toward that.
Beautiful. And this is not on our list, so hopefully this isn't too much of a curveball, but listening to you speak, it made me think about clients that were in the process of leaving a certain religious structure. Any suggestions for that particular situation?
Oh, yes. Oh, this is so I always tell folks, especially if there is a case of religious trauma or spiritual abuse, I think for clinicians offering support and affirmation in the midst of that, whatever that looks like for the individual or for the client, that can also, if there are spaces that a faith leader might be helpful, whether that's comfortable actually with the client or even just for consultation. That's work that I love to do or can recommend other chaplains who really like to do that. That for me actually often is where I come in, where someone doesn't have a religious leader or where someone has left a particular community. But I think letting the individual know, letting the client know that whatever is comfortable for them is wonderful and that you're happy to collaborate with someone and learn about the process. There's an opportunity to bring folks in still. That can be great. And there's a lack of research right now really on religious trauma and spiritual abuse and the connection to scrupulosity. So that's actually, there's a group of us in the process of trying to get some things together on that right now to start some studies because unfortunately, I know that can really complicate things for so many individuals.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you're doing that work. And as a final note, you mentioned getting together studies. What are the best resources that you can point lived experiencers of scrupulosity OCD, clinicians? What are the best ways for us to learn more and deepen our understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So always love the International OCD Foundation's Faith and OCD resource page. I worked with a group of awesome clinicians over the years putting that together. And then we also have the IOCDF annual Faith and OCD Virtual Conference, which is a beautiful opportunity to connect. And then on a more regular basis, I know we mentioned Stick with the Ick. I am so honored to run the Stick with the Ick app and virtual community that is free to download. And it's actually color coded where there are sections for clinicians, for clergy, and for individuals with OCD, where there are courses, there are support groups, and there are all sorts of different ways to connect. There are even support groups now by religious and spiritual traditions so that someone can connect with others of their faith. There are things that are clinician run, faith leader run, and advocate run, but there's, different facets where clinicians really can grow and learn, but also where faith leaders can grow and learn and where individuals with OCD can seek support.
Amazing. I didn't even know that. I am going to download that app right now and recommend to all my clinicians that they do so as well to work with Faith OCD. I am so honored to have had you on this webinar. It was an incredible pleasure. Thank you so much, Reverend Kta&x.
Thank you so much.